tonight's program. Our presenter is Mohammed Saleh, who is a doctoral student at the Annenberg School for Communications. He's primarily interested in extremist movements in the Middle East and also the intersection of media, politics, and culture in the region. He worked for a number of years as a freelance journalist covering the Islamic State and also reporting on problems of Kurds in Iraq and other areas. Now, I don't know about you, but if you followed the news in the last several years, last 20 years, you are familiar with the plight of the Kurds. Over 30 million people, the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have its own homeland. And of course, they're scattered in different countries, in Turkey, of course, in Iraq, in Iran, and other parts of the Middle East. But the crimes committed against the Kurds are unspeakable. You may recall that Saddam Hussein, after the first Gulf War, actually used poison gas and killed Kurdish people just indiscriminately. And that since then, there have been problems. Turkey, for instance, has made some aggressive statements regarding Kurds, not just in Turkey, but in other places in the Middle East. And so I really a heartfelt feeling about the Kurds in the world. And Mohammed is, a matter of fact, a Kurd. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce him, and we want you to welcome Mohammed to Camden County College. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack, and thanks to the Camden County College's Center for inviting me. And I'd like also to thank all of you for coming here and showing this interest in a topic which is not necessarily a happy topic or a happy talk, but I hope that you will find it interesting and engaging. And thanks to you, Jack, also for that really heartfelt introduction and also your introduction of the Kurdish situation in the Middle East. Today, I'm going to be talking about a subject that has been around for 5 years in a sort of constant and non-stop matter in the media. So 5 years ago, in the summer of 2014 precisely, the world was really taken aback and shocked by the dramatic rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which was the name of the group at that point. And ever since, we have all seen, like on our television screens, computers, and through other media means, what the group has done in a span of 5 years in terms of atrocities and crime that it has committed in the region. And so scenes like the one on the right with the group's fighters in their sort of typical black uniforms and carrying the black flags have been ever since really circulating around in the media and have sort of horrified and shocked the whole world. We have also seen scenes of carnage that ISIS has created in different cities across the world, whether in the Muslim world or also in the West and in other continents. In Asia, for example, there are numerous and multiple terrorist actions in different parts of the world. And we have also seen the images of the heroic and brave fight that has been put up against the group and its violent actions in the region. And so like one of the most sort of prominent groups that has been fighting ISIS in the region have been the Kurds, along with other major actors, the Iraqi military forces, the US-led global coalition. And so scenes like the one on the top with the Kurdish female fighters have been also really part of the media coverage, an important part of the media coverage and sort of an iconic visual to this whole sort of situation and the unfortunate sort of consequences of the rise of ISIS. So what I'm going to be today, I'm going to talk about or try to offer an understanding on the history of the group, on the ideology of the group, and based on that and based on their sort of past trajectory, hopefully offer insights in terms of what we should expect the group might be doing next. So of course I'm not going to speak sort of as someone who predicts things. That's very difficult, and you need to have a crystal ball to be able to do that really. But I think there are valuable insights that we can really get based on the group's history and on the group's ideology and what it has done so far and where it might be going from here. I would also like to ask all of you if anyone was planning to sort of tweet in real time, live tweet. Please don't do that. You can do that later if you want, but please don't do that while the event is going on. So the world has been really preoccupied by ISIS. There has been sort of a global obsession with the group, what it is, what is it that it wants, and what is it that it plans to do. And what hopefully we will be doing today, what I'm hoping to sort of do and achieve from this talk is try to, as much as possible, really get into the mind of the group and sort of understand them from their own perspective. And hopefully, as I said, that that will sort of enable us to be able to sort of see where they might be going from here. So in terms of the genealogy of the group that we today call the Islamic State, of course, in the media and political circles is mostly referred to as ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, which is the Arabic acronym of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. But at the present moment, actually since 2014, the group has, renamed or rebranded itself as the Islamic group. So what you see here on the screen is basically the genealogy of the group when it first started and its evolution over the course of primarily since 2003 with the US-led invasion of Iraq. But the first group on the top, the monotheism and jihad group, has been around since 1999. In fact, it was founded by the person that you see on the screen, the image, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian national and was a jihadi figure. He was sort of a low-key jihadi figure, really didn't have, the sort of reputation or the fame or the infamy that he later gained. But in 1999, while he was still in Afghanistan, he founded the monotheism and jihad group. And later he moved to Iraq a couple of years before the invasion. But when the U.S.-led coalition invaded Iraq and the regime of Saddam Hussein was overthrown, that really provided an ideal sort of opportunity and moment for this group to assert itself on the scene and start to recruit in an extensive and unprecedented manner and gradually grow and evolve into what it has become now. So in the first sort of couple of earlier versions of IS, that is the monotheism and jihad group and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Mujahideen Consultative Council. And Mujahideen is basically the name for someone who wages jihad, or for lack of a better word, holy war. So those three iterations of IS were really mainly concerned with launching an insurgency against the US-led troops and their Iraqi allies inside Iraq. And it was at some point in 2006 when the group really sort of started to embrace some sort of serious statehood ambition, or in other words, the ambition of establishing a political entity on a territory that it could control, that it could rule, and not just be, an insurgent or a guerrilla type of group that, does what any sort of classic insurgency would do. At some point prior to that, in 2004, it officially became also a franchise of Al-Qaeda, of global Al-Qaeda. So at that point, it changed its name to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And 2 years later, which was after the death of Zarqawi by the US forces, the group changed its name or rebranded itself as the Islamic State of Iraq, and for the first time really signaling a serious intention and ambition toward sort of moving toward a state or some sort of political entity or polity. In the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI as it was known, was initially quite successful in terms of being able to really derail the political process in the country to an extent, especially in the parts of Iraq where the Sunni Arab population live, which is almost like territory-wise one third of the size of the country. But then at some point, due to its really extremely violent and indiscriminate attacking and targeting of not only, US-led sort of coalition troops or the Iraqi troops, but also the civilian populations in the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq, there was this popular backlash against the group, which presented this really important opportunity that the US and the Iraqi government had been really waiting for and trying to achieve for a number of years in terms of winning over the support of the Sunni Arab population. And so as a result of those extremely violent and atrocious acts of the group, there was a coalition between local Sunni Arab tribes, the Iraqi government, and the US troops that really weakened greatly the Islamic State of Iraq. So by at around 2008 and 2009, the group had really lost its capability to be as lethal as it used to be. The bulk of its leadership, almost 3/4 of its leadership had been eliminated. And so the group was in a state of severe decline at that point. And that really lasted until two other major events happened. The first one with the US troops withdrawal from Iraq by at some point around the end of 2011, which, as we all know, was not really a good decision, and in retrospect is even clearer. But it happened while Iraq had not really stabilized, and all sorts of different threats to the stability of the country were still present, especially from the jihadi groups, but also lack of cooperation and intervention by the neighboring countries. And so when the US troops pulled out, the Iraqi government, which had been dominated by the Shia sect ever since the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein in 2003, started to really sort of walk back on its agreement with the local Sunnis, and it started antagonizing them. And so there was a wave of protests in the Sunni areas, and the government responded with really maximum use of force and took highly repressive measures. And so the combination of that with the civil war that had started at some point around late 2011 in neighboring Syria provided really a very important and somehow unexpected breathing room for ISI. So what they did at that point, they sent some sort of a vanguard group to Syria, and so they started recruiting in Syria, sort of capitalizing on the chaos. They're taking advantage of the chaos and the security and power vacuum in the Sunni Arab parts of Syria mostly. And so that combined with the Iraqi government's repressive measures really sort of breathed new life into the group, and sort of all of a sudden, out of nowhere really, it made a comeback from the shadow. And so from that period between 2011 to 2013 was very crucial. The group managed to sort of rebound and reorganize and sort of revitalize itself. And at some point in April 2013, it changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, because at that point it was actually operating on both sides of the border in both Iraq and Syria. It had gained control over some significant, although not really large or extensive at that point yet, parts of Syrian territory. And then, it started planning to branch out into Iraq by seizing territory. They were already present in Iraq by, launching their sort of, insurgency-style attacks. But then they all of a sudden started to actually seize territory in Iraq. And at some point, which was when it really came into international spotlight, in the summer of 2014, they managed to seize as much as 1/3 of the Iraqi territory. Basically, almost all, if not the great bulk of the Sunni Arab majority areas in Iraq, and also a great part on the other side, on the Syrian side, again, of the area that were populated by the Sunni Arab population in that country. And so the reason why the group has also been able to mostly operate in the Sunni Arab parts of both countries has to do really with the power dynamics and communal relations in both countries, where the Sunni Arabs, like in Iraq, Sunni Arabs were in power ever since the foundation of the country in 1920s until 2003 when the US went in, and all of a sudden they found themselves out of power and all the privileges that they had as a community as a result of their access to power. And in Syria, they have been the numerical majority in the country, but they have been really marginalized by a small sort of sect in Syria, which is called the Alawite sect, that basically, from which the major Syrian leaders, civilian and military, hail from. So in the summer of 2014, to put it in a nutshell, IS really came on the stage and became this phenomenon that really took the whole world by surprise. And nobody expected such a spectacular turn of events and such a, really spectacular sort of emergence of this group on the regional stage. So as a result of their expansion into Iraq, in 2014, 2015, and 16, they basically, as you can see on the map, so every area that is in red, gray, or black were ICE-controlled areas, and the areas in between that you see are white. Those are really unpopulated sort of desert areas, so nobody lived there. But they were in control of a large territory in both countries that was estimated to be actually the size of the United Kingdom in terms of the size of the territory. And they also, having started since a while ago to really conceive and think of themselves as a state and sort of formally announcing that in a practical manner in 2014, they started redrawing the provincial boundaries. So at some point, at the peak of the group's power, it had 34 provinces, and not only in Iraq and Syria. There is another map that I have I should go to quickly. So they have been operational in all of these places that you see in red. So the core of their state has been in Iraq and Syria, but they have had also what they call wilayas or provinces in a number of other places, such as in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, Algeria, in Nigeria, in the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan as well. So the group at this point, really after 2014, started to establish, sort of the infrastructure and the structure that the state has in terms of a civilian and military bureaucracy, and also, trying to act as a state by actually providing public services in the area that it was controlling. So this was a really unprecedented move by any group of that sort, and you can think of its others, of other similar groups such as Al-Qaeda or other ones, but this was really for the first time that an extremist group, Salafi jihadi group, had really been able to establish a state on that magnitude and muster and gather that sort of force and become really a topic and object of global discussion and also sensation as well. So all of this brings us to the important question that what is the IS vision? What is it that IS wants? So the group is, in academic terms, scholarly terms, is categorized as a Salafi jihadi group. So the word Salaf basically refers to the early Islamic period, 14 centuries ago, that has been always seen and conceived by Islamist groups, but also really just generally in Islamic history and memory as an idealized and romanticized period. And so that is sort of the golden era or standard for especially Islamist groups in terms of what they want to achieve and revive. And by Islamist groups, I should really say in particular Salafi jihadi groups. So the word Salaf itself means forebearers or forefathers. So it refers to that early formative period of the rise of Islam. And in terms of the group's ideology, the major way that we can understand and think of how it sees the world and what it wants is this sort of binary or dichotomy of what is in Arabic known as Jahiliyyah versus Hakimiyya, but sort of in English, a better sort of way of putting that would be the idea of sovereignty of God versus the sovereignty of man. So from the group's perspective, any type of system of rule on earth that does not implement God's laws, that is not formed based on the vision, that is laid out in the Quran and the way that they understand it, and does not conform with that early sort of golden Islamic period, is really a system of ignorance or jahiliyyah. And so that means any political system or regime in the world which actually operates through man-made laws is in opposition to the sovereignty of God, because what these kind of systems do, whether you want to think of a democracy, of a communist system, capitalist system, liberal system, anything, the common denominator of all these other groups, secular groups, is really that they are putting the sovereignty of man, the right of man to rule, above the right of God to rule. And so that means that they reject every system of rule on the earth that exists today, whether it's in the Islamic countries or beyond in the West or in other parts of the world. So that is really the core sort of formative element in terms of their political ideology, how they view the world, and what they see their mission to be. And the mission is to really establish a system where only sovereignty belongs to God, and then expand that system in a way that, from their perspective, would ideally include the whole, face of the globe. And so, based on that, what they are trying to do is reviving an ideal form of Islamic state or polity, which is called caliphate, which has not been in existence really since 1920s, with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that also claimed at some point to be a caliphate and situated itself within that larger tradition and history of Islamic rule. And that is what IS is really trying to do today. It sort of presents itself as the reviver of the religion, and also as the only righteous group that really seriously wants to revive that form of caliphate rule and expand, that rule all over the world. So in terms of other ambitions of the group, once the state is in place, it imposes a strict version of religious laws, or the way that it interprets and understands those laws. And I believe that you have all seen or heard the stories of its really harsh implementation of those laws vis-a-vis women, vis-a-vis people of sort of non-Islamic backgrounds, and also people of with sort of non-normative sexual orientations. So in that regard, again, it's a group that does not give itself the right to really legislate new laws. So the idea is that these laws have been already passed down to humanity through Islam. It's a complete and perfect system. We cannot legislate new laws. We can probably have interpretations of some of them, but really that this ideal perfect system of laws exists, is out there, and all that an Islamic entity or polity or political system would do is the implementation of those laws. And so any ideas of modern political ideologies are consequently rejected by the group. So in terms of its territorial ambitions, it does not really, the way that it sees its mission, this is not only something for Iraq and Syria or for those other areas on the map that I showed you, or for the broader Muslim world. It sees itself as a group with a mission to really implement its political program all over the globe if it could. So whether it can or could, that's a totally different matter, and there are very serious obstacles to that, of course. So what has happened, if you have been following the news, Since a few weeks ago, IS's caliphate or state, the territorial state in Iraq and Syria collapsed. So they lost the last main sort of patch of territory that was in Syria that they were still in control of. And you have been also probably hearing that President Trump has claimed that IS has been defeated and that he wants to pull out the US troops from Syria. But given that trajectory of the group and the way that, the type of resilience that it has really shown and the capability it has shown to adapt itself to new changing circumstances, all of that begs the question whether we are actually witnessing or we have witnessed the end of IS. And my short answer to that is no. And the longer answer will hopefully emerge in the sort of course of the talk and the remainder of this talk. So in the IS, has been really known for its highly sophisticated, extensive communication and propaganda campaign. And they, at some point, they really flooded the social media in particular and the internet with their propaganda materials. And, gruesome videos and images of beheadings or whatnot. And basically, they have been really very proud in terms of propagating their atrocities, which makes, which is one of the ways that they really stand out in comparison to any other group, similar group, but also to any sort of system of ruling that is in the world. Like everywhere, the approach is, even if governments or groups commit ferocious and atrocious criminal acts, they would not really, disseminate them for everyone to see. But IS has been, very keen and willing to actually propagate and disseminate those acts for everyone to see in the world. And so in one of their important propaganda materials, which was a magazine named Dabik, which has been out of publication since 2016, they offered this chart that I've put here, where they basically showed the trajectory of the group, where it started, or sort of what are the steps from like step one to the ultimate aim or goal, which is the establishment of the caliphate. So the first step was described as the migration, that is the coming together or the migration of, of a sort of core of committed individuals who seriously believe in the group's ideology, in the group's cause. And so the migration of all these individuals, or a number of them, to a certain location, and they're coming together, or the congregation, which is the second step. And then after that, starting a campaign of insurgency with the aim of destabilizing, the particular country or a state where they are operating within, which used to be Iraq up until 2011. And so after having successfully carried out the destabilization campaign, which they did in Iraq and Syria, then the next step is the consolidation of their gains and starting to really control territory and not only act as an insurgent group. And at the sort of the last step, or the culmination of that process, is the establishment of a state or caliphate. And so that is, they initially moved from step one of this process to step 5 within a span of like 10 years really, from 2004 to 2014. And so today, given that we really hear a lot, in the media and also from leaders around the world, claiming that IS has been defeated. Of course, some other people disagree and dispute that claim, but when we are really hearing any claims of IS having been defeated or even obliterated or eliminated, looking at this chart, my understanding is that actually the group is just sort of back down to step 3 out of this sort of 5-step process that they have laid out in terms of how to get to the point of establishing a caliphate. So at this point, they don't really need to go through steps 1 and 2 again, because they already have developed really that sort of core group of members and sympathizers which are there on the ground, and they have been battle hardened. They now have the know-how, the knowledge of how to run an insurgency. They know the areas where they operate in. They have the resources, whether in terms of weaponry or even financial resources, to be able to launch an insurgency, a renewed insurgency campaign. And so at this point, they are really at the stage 3. That does not mean, again, that the group is invincible, or it cannot be defeated in a sort of more categorical way. But as of now, the group is still really around. And so in different pockets of territory in both Iraq and Syria, which is the core of the caliphate or the state, they are still operational and launching what some of the observers have called really an active and aggressive insurgency. And according to some estimates by the Pentagon, they have anywhere between 20 to 30,000 fighters, which are sort of, have merged back into the civilian population, acting largely as, sleeper cells, but they still also have some active fighting units which are in areas with rugged territory in Iraq and Syria that allow them to really hide out and be able to operate. This one is a chart from a study, an article that was put out by West Point's Combating Terrorism Center that shows the level of their military activity. So at the end of 2017, in December 2017 precisely, when the Iraqi government really regained territory, the territory that it had lost to ISIS, the Iraqi prime minister claimed that ISIS had been defeated. We again, as I said, we have heard the same, or similar claims from President Trump and other folks. But if you look at this chart, in 2018, in the first 10 months of 2018, that is right after the declaration of victory over ISIS by the Iraqi government, they have been actually able to launch a monthly average of 127 attacks in Iraq alone, and that's not including Syria. Of course, compared to the previous year, 2017, the number has fallen and decreased quite considerably, but that's really still a quite significant and remarkable sort of figure, 127 attacks on average in a month. And so that really shows that the group has now mustered the capabilities to survive despite the tremendous odds and the pressure, the tremendous local and international pressure that they are facing. And that is, due to a number of reasons that I will talk about in the next sort of a slide. I should also say in terms of their favorite methods of insurgency, really, it's, they engage in hit and run acts, or their most effective weaponry is the use of suicide bombing or roadside bombs. And so they are, at this point, back to that sort of practice again in Iraq and in Syria, but particularly in Iraq, where they have found sort of an environment where they can survive. So this was the map that I showed you earlier. If you look, Iraq and Syria, which is or used to be the core of their caliphate, is now, that caliphate has come to an end territorially in terms of actually being able to operate as a state. It no longer exists as a state, but it is still, maintains an operational capability in both countries. And in other parts of the world, in Northern Africa, Central and toward Eastern Africa, and also in the areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as far as in Philippines, they are in control of sort of small areas of territory. But, nothing sort of significant as they used to have in Iraq and Syria up until recently, especially up until the end of 2017. So all of this really sort of takes us back to the question that I asked or posed at the beginning of the talk, whether IS has ended or whether it can survive. And so if you look at what's happening on the ground, there is still a bunch of factors that are really conducive to the survival of the group, in the sense that it allowed them to recruit. Those factors sort of create or leave a certain segment of the population that could be receptive to their recruitment and messaging or messages. And also the broader really sort of failure of the states in Iraq and Syria, and the significant sort of power and security vacuum that exists in both of those countries really still has provided so far a sort of environment for this group to be able to exist and operate within and survive. And so among some of the important factors that are still there and are aiding and helping the continuation of the group, one, or the primary one, is really the repression and marginalization of the Sunni Arab population in both Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, the government has taken a step sort of to address some of those grievances, and has really started to treat its Sunni population much, much better compared to like a few years ago. But in Syria, with the Syrian government having survived the civil war, and with its primary really victim and targets being the Sunni members of the Sunni Arab population in the country, and with large parts of the country, as you see in this image, being really in ruins and being unsuitable for like human habitation and living, that is really an important factor that drives a serious wedge or a schism between the state apparatus and the Sunni Arab populations in both countries, but as I said, particularly in Syria. Another important factor on top of that is really the weak and corrupt state apparatus and structures which are in place in both countries. And again, the weakness means that they're not, as of now, able to really reassert their control in a firm manner in both countries over the Sunni areas, the Sunni parts of both countries. And the corruption really means that the state does not or cannot muster the resources needed to address the grievances of this population, whether economically or in other ways. It also means in terms of the way that the security forces are functioning in both countries. There are members of security forces or apparatus in both countries that are resorting to extrajudicial means in terms of their treatment of the Sunnis, such as, detentions and executions, which are not lawful. And also, in some cases, you still hear stories of how some of the members of IS, for example, that have been captured can somehow miraculously bribe their way out of prisons. And so that sort of corruption element and dynamic really helps, sort of prepare or create a kind of environment that helps the survival of the group. And again, on top of all of that is the colossal, massive, extensive destruction of the bulk of Sunni towns in both Iraq and Syria, which means, in some parts of these two countries, people cannot really go back to their normal ways of living, and that requires huge sort of amount of funds to reconstruct these areas, and the governments in both countries have not really shown the sort of willingness to offer the resources. In the case of Syria, the government is totally bankrupt. It even does not have, if it wanted, presumably on goodwill to do that, they're not able to do that, except if with the help of Russia or the international community at some point. But even Russia is not really in a sort of position to be able to to provide those resources. In the case of Iraq, there has been a slow reconstruction campaign, but the people on the ground are still really by and large unhappy and complain from lack of services. Their homes are in ruins, and so it's not really easy, or it's not going to happen quickly, this kind of reconstruction of the towns and areas of the Sunni Arab populations in both countries. In the case of Syria also, the fact that the government of Bashar al-Assad has been able to stay in power despite 8 years of an uprising and civil war, a bloody civil war, which has been the largest humanitarian disaster in the world since World War II, with as much as or as many as half of the country really being displaced from their homes, either internally or having fled the country, and the sort of the situation of the cities being how you see on the screen. And what could really also contribute to further deterioration of the conditions in both countries is a possible U.S. troops withdrawal, which would be a repeat of what happened in 2011, when Iraq had not really stabilized it to be able to stand on its feet. And if that is going to happen, and in particular in Syria, that would really be, a gift from heaven for IS or for similar groups. That would revitalize and reinvigorate them and allow them the kind of breathing space that they are hoping to get to be able to reorganize, regroup, and go back to doing what they used to do. So having said all of that, I would like to sort of, as wrapping up the talk, but also recapping my central argument, to say that the IS Caliphate's core in Iraq and Syria is over. The state apparatus that they had set up is at this point over, has collapsed, but they still maintain a significant presence in both countries, in particular in Iraq. And what's more, beyond these two countries, they still have a significant operational capability and significant sort of territory that they control in other parts of the world in the region, from Philippines in East Asia, as far as Philippines to Northern and Western Africa. And so the group has been greatly weakened, but it's sort of laying down in a way and waiting for that perfect moment again to really be able to revitalize itself and re-emerge in a major way. And the circumstances on the ground in both countries, in Iraq and Syria, are really sort of still providing the space that they need to be able to exist and to survive. And the determination of a really core group of members and individuals in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere means that we are not really going to see an elimination of the group, anytime soon. Again, I'm not trying to say that they are invincible. They are not, but given the objective conditions and circumstances on the ground, they are still able to, to continue to live and exist, even if in some sort of a low profile or, low-key way. So with that, I bring it to an end, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.